Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute.'" In verse 15, "And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards his brothers talked with him."
Next reading is Psalm 37, 1 to 11. "Do not fret because of evil men, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, the justice of your cause like the noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when men succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it leads only to evil. For evil men will be cut off, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. A little while, and the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they will not be found. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy great peace."
Love for enemies. But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to one who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Judging others. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you.
I'd like to just make some references to this image, which is a source of some contemplation, and it puts a testimony in a context. This is called the egg, the cosmic egg, or the universal egg. Christ is cosmic. In other words, he is the Christ of the universe. He's not just a God of some people. He is the Christ. And so it's really worth reflecting as I begin my story at the bottom to put it into a context. Our stories individually are where we begin, obviously. They are flawed, they can have bias because we're just individuals. But they're very important, and we need to, in order to be a healthy person, we really need to start with ourselves. And then the second category is our story. Everyone who you see as being part of you in some way, either your family, my friends, my church, my golf club, my school, and then it goes further out. It could be my country. But it's everything that you feel sort of gives you a sense of membership. Maybe it's ethnicity, maybe it's language, maybe it's faith, it's all sorts of things. The more complicated level is the third one, because it's the other. It's the other person who we can feel distanced from. And it's really amazing to me that we chose, or that Colleen chose, that song about love our enemies, because that's where our real troubles can begin. It can range from, something as simple as a sporting code difference to an international threat. And it is a problematic layer if we respond to people who are different from us with suspicion and fear, just because they are other. So this other is important in broadening our understanding, our love and our empathy. Then we have the top layer, which is the story, God's story. It speaks to all people. And the wonderful thing is that the Bible integrates all of these layers. And we saw that in our readings, where the story of Joseph incorporates clearly all layers. Because there's his life story, but there's also the story of his family. That is our. And the third layer of the Egyptians. But the overriding thing that comes through in the Joseph story is that God had a plan for him. It was all part of God's plan. And then in our gospel reading, extracted from the Sermon on the Mount, it's a fantastic example of how great the story is. I mean, love and forgiveness is a universal thing, isn't it? You don't just, some cultures love. It is a human, common story. And that's why Jesus is the wonderful manifestation of the story. And if we're to be healthy Christian people, we really need to consider all of those levels. And as I tell my story, you'll see how those levels can work in another person's life. And I hope that you find it of some help. Joyce made a comment in her sermon a few weeks ago about looking back on our lives and being reminded about God's provision and protection throughout our lives. Of course, our journeys are all very different. I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow account of the events of my life like a biography, but I'm going to isolate incidents and people who've had the greatest influence on my Christian walk. And it's godly people whose faithfulness and devotion, unfailing love, courage and thankfulness who have influenced my journey profoundly. I focus quite a bit on my early years because I'm sure you identify with this, that for most of us, for better or for worse, that is where the greatest influences often lie. I was blessed to be born to parents who independently chose to leave the familiarities of life in England for lives as volunteer missionaries in Central Africa. Both of them came from devout homes. My father, Walter Goodall, was priested very young in the Anglican Church, and after serving his diaconate on the Isle of Man, joined the USPG, which stands for, rather a long term, United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And he sailed to Cape Town, which in those days took a few weeks. And then there was the long train ride from Cape Town up through South Africa, through what's now Zimbabwe and Zambia. Northern Rhodesia, then it was called, to Lusaka. And the mission station he was headed for was called Chipili, and it lay just south of the Congo border. It was really remote. You could drive in, but when it came to ministering to the people, it was on bicycle, or more likely in dugout, because it was marshland. And of course they were affected on several occasions, both of my parents, with malaria, in spite of quinine tablets. A couple of years later, my mother, then a young nurse, Sylvia Rowley, arrived at Chipili as a missionary district nurse. She was trained under the very harsh circumstances because she was in central London during the Blitz, and she was studying literally in bunkers underground, writing exams during air raids, and she was quite traumatized, I think, by the awful images and people that she had to deal with, often firemen who came out of the docks, with all the bombing that went along the Thames. And so she felt called to, one, leave England, but for the purpose of mission work. She studied tropical diseases and dispensing at London University and learned fluent Chibemba before she left England. I have photographs of the hut that she lived in and the remote mission station with its surprisingly large church, because it wasn't a town, it was just a mission station in the middle of bush, but there were populations of people all around. And this place is testimony, and it's still there, by the way, to the people who responded to the work of faithful missionaries over the decades. So today, when I hear disparaging comments about missionaries as land grabbers and colonialists who robbed Indigenous people of their tribal heritage, there may be some truth in that, but I think of people like my parents who faithfully did this work for no pay at all. In the name of Christ, they brought release to those who lived in fear of deadly curses, which were very real to people if they thought they'd been cursed. There was no primary health care, no schooling, and the mission stations provided all of that. Sylvia and Walter met, fell in love. You weren't allowed to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend on the mission station, and they were packed off to England, where they got married and decided they were not going to stay in England, and they wanted to return to mission work. So they went to, this time under the authority of the Church of the Province of South Africa, they settled on a mission station in Zululand called Italaneni. I went there a few years ago. It's still as remote as ever. You go along hard corrugated roads, over drifts, and finally you get there. But what's interesting historically about Italaneni, it's just round the valley from the site of the Battle of Isandlwana during the Zulu Wars in the 19th century, where the British had their heaviest losses at Isandlwana in any battle they had with the Zulus. And also, it wasn't very far from the site of the Rorke's Drift battle, where British soldiers won more Victoria Crosses than in any other battle since. The film Zulu tells that story. For 10 years, my parents lived and worked on this mission station. My father spoke fluent Zulu. My sister spoke Zulu before she spoke English. And he took regular services, did pastoral care, he counselled, he superintended several schools, I don't know how he did it, visited outlying churches, and maintained a working relationship with local chiefs who were powerful people. Through the Mothers' Union, my mum did great work with the women, teaching them basic baby and child care, primary health, and nutrition. So during those 10 years, my two brothers and I, my sister, were born. I was actually born in England, but that was on their sabbatical. And it couldn't have been easy as I reflect for my parents. Financial support was minimal. And I've got letters that my father wrote to England describing the work and appealing for funds for it to continue. They grew veggies, maize, kept cows and chickens, there being no quick trips to any shops. The mission was remote, and even today, as I said, it's challenging. There were, in that part of Zululand, there are electric storms right through summer, almost daily, and quite violent lightning, which was problematic because they often caused bushfires. And those bushfires could move faster than you can run. And on one Sunday morning during the service, church was full, this fire swept through the mission station, circling the church, burning down trees, crops, our garage, and we had about 4 storage rondavels, which are huts, at the back of the house, took them out, but it went round the house in which we 4 good old children were sleeping. Truly a miracle. I tell you all this because it was only as an adult that I developed some understanding of the faithfulness and perseverance that my parents exemplified. That we are at times called to work outside of our comfort zones, and that we are called to be bold and persistent. Like the man in Luke chapter 11, verse 5 and 6, who asks his neighbour for help in the middle of the night. Our family were given our loaves of bread, and while life may have been challenging, our home was an environment of thankfulness and joy. As children, we never felt poor, even though we lived very simply. My parents had a great sense of celebration and thankfulness. They truly made the most of things. And I remember my mum used to place food on a plate very carefully, and it was as if this was something precious. And I've only seen that again when I saw a Japanese young woman. She came to my home to do a Japanese meal, and she had that same care in putting and valuing what we had, food. And it spoke to us, they spoke to us through their actions and not a great deal of talking. We were much loved and devotedly cared for. The fact that all the good old children have remained believers through our lives is testament to our parents' example and the grace of God. One of the costs of living the way we did was that we had to go to boarding school as very young children. My older sister went off at 5. But we were privileged in that as clergy children, we were given special entrance to church schools, which were private schools in South Africa, minus these huge fees. And as missionary kids, we were mixing with children who were very different to us, mostly well-off backgrounds, as you can imagine, children of wealthy farmers, business people, and diplomats, because the diplomatic corps was really based in Pretoria. My sister and I only went home 3 times a year, and I always felt homesick. And while it was fun visiting fancy homes of schoolmates in Johannesburg and Pretoria, and farms in Tabazimbi and Nelspruit, we missed our old house with its roof that needed rocks on it to keep the metal in place, its dining room floor that was so slanted, and this is true, our soup had a deep and a shallow end. And we missed the loving gentleness of our mum and humour of our dad, and the gentleness of the communities that we lived in. I used to feel a particular affinity with the school's African kitchen hands and cleaners because they reminded me of home. The sisters who ran St. Mary's in Pretoria they were Anglican community of sisters, English, who were highly influential in our lives at St. Mary's. Their devotion and personal discipline made a great impression on us and on me. The services in the school chapel were beautiful. Our school choir, of which very early on I became a member, learned wonderful church music, sung masses, and harmonized hymns. The nuns knew how to worship and adore, and they went to great lengths to show us the way. For instance, they captured for the girls the spirit of Good Friday, with the stripping of the chapel of all its flowers and adornments. We were encouraged to be silent and reflective on Good Friday. And even in Standard 2, I attended at least half of the 3-hour service. And then on Holy Saturday, we used to build these wonderful Easter gardens, each from a form of level girls wanted the best garden, so it became quite competitive. We had waterfalls and pools around the cave where Jesus is buried, under the rocky Golgotha, still with its 3 crosses on top, and the little pieces of material around each cross, for where they take the body down. And that evening, as part of our bringing of the light service, we would slide the stone away from our cave, revealing the empty tomb with the little flattened grave clothes and head bandages on one side, inside the tombs. And on Easter Day, the chapel would be resplendent with a riot of white and yellow flowers. We truly experienced the lows and highs of that most important of weekends in the church calendar. I have such a clear picture in my mind's eye of sitting in the little side chapel with all those flowers and that care and that cross and the reserved communion there with its red light, and really sensing the presence of God. And I was quite ambivalent about doing my testimony. And then Barbara last week mentioned her 4-year-old granddaughter going to church with her in Opanaki, and how that child said to Barbara, I feel as if God is in this place. And that was certainly my experience as a very young child. And it hasn't left me. It made a profound impact on me, and I felt very close to God. I felt something of the pain of the cross, the devastation of Christ's death, and then that wonderful Easter joy. And I'm so thankful to the sisters who were instrumental in bringing it all to life. Over the years, my family moved several times. For instance, we spent 8 years living in 2 different places in Basotho land, now called Lesotho. It's a strange thing because it's a kingdom. It's an independent state, but it's stuck in the middle of South Africa, in a very mountainous and poor place it is too. The Msotho people were much poorer than the Zulus, if that can be imagined. There was no way that the church could be maintained from the offerings of the churchgoers. Many of them just didn't have any money. Some would walk many miles barefoot to come to a service every now and then. Then when they arrived, they would whip out a precious pair of shoes, probably their only ones, so that they could look respectable for the occasion. Wearing them beyond that would have shortened the life of these treasured possessions, which probably lasted them a lifetime. I have a photograph of some men scything the mission grass around the church in lieu of monetary offerings. The mission's outstations and many of the parishioners were only accessible on horseback. So we kept horses for this purpose, which of course for us kids was great because we were able to ride horses during the holidays. And I well remember one occasion when Mary, my sister, and I went with my dad to a village on the flatlands. It wasn't in the mountains, which were right there, but there was part of the outreach area was in lowlands as well. And we went with my dad on one of his sick communion visits. It was a fair distance in the car, and then a long walk to a small little village where a very elderly Msotho woman lived. We were welcomed into her small, earthen-floored, spotlessly clean mud hut. And after she had received communion, she insisted that Mary and I look in the glass jar on the little nook in the wall. Inside were 2 10-cent pieces for us. We were very shy about accepting her priceless gift, given her poverty and challenging circumstances. But we accepted as graciously as we could when Dad indicated that it would be an affront not to. I still think of that old lady when I read the story of the widow with her bit offering in the temple, who gave away all she had. I attended university in Durban, where I majored in speech and drama and English. The early 70s was a time of Pentecostal renewal in the church worldwide. And it was exciting in some respects, especially for student life, because it was also alive. However, I, for years, felt like a second-hand Christian when, despite answering many altar calls, I was never slain in the Spirit or given to speaking in tongues. Some years later, I was given peace about this matter by a church elder. As a student, I attended national multiracial conferences of Christian students, which were a highlight. Here we get to our level 3, the other, which in South Africa was very clear because we had separate development, which means you had separate places to live, you had separate schools, you had separate universities. So you would have a university for Xhosa people, another one for Zulu people, another one for so-called coloured people, another one for Indian people, one for English people, another one for Afrikaans. It was just like that. And it was just the way of life. So you can imagine when, as students, we went to Fort Hare University, which is known for for the fact that many of the ANC leaders were Xhosas under Mandela, who was a Xhosa, and that's where they went to university. But anyway, here we were. We'd never sat really as fellow students with people of other races. And there we were. This is 20 years before the democratic elections in 1994. It was a potent experience for young South Africans of all colours to worship together and be reminded of the story, in spite of our living separately. We shared one loving and forgiving God. As a young teacher on the Natal coast, I became somewhat lukewarm in my faith journey. Just starting as a teacher, for those of you who've been teachers, is pretty hectic. And, you just were sort of catching up all the time, really. But also I just didn't really, I felt a bit lukewarm about the whole thing and going to church. It almost felt like a bit of a hassle. However, I never doubted who I belonged to. I always felt that God was a presence in my life. And it was really only once I got married and we had children that we became a church family. It was a great joy to see our children comfortably and trustingly settling into Sunday school and the church family. Over the years, we moved towns every 3 years at least. Each time there was another church community, another family home group, a different ministry to be involved in. And this proved to be a very good preparation for our immigration to New Zealand a decade later, because we didn't know a soul here. In South Africa, my husband Bernard and I were both lay ministers and were very active in church life. In the early 80s, I started using Selwyn Hughes's daily devotional, Judith, Every Day with Jesus. Used it for 40 years, and at the end of December, they stopped publication. There is a supplement book now that's out for the year with sort of themes, and it's extracts from Selwyn's writing. But it sort of feels quite something, doesn't it, to suddenly not have that. Our decision to leave South Africa in 1994 was predicated by the increasing unpredictability of life and the violence that we experienced locally in Eshowe, a town in KwaZulu where Bernard was principal. The conflict between the ANC and Zulu Inkatha Freedom Party, it was very tribal. So it was the Xhosas, who were the sort of ANC supporters, and on the other side was the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was Zulu, and under the Zulu king. And we had a mixture of those people in Eshowe and people who were involved with our school. That school was multiracial. So what happened was that one of our Year 9 students, a Zulu boy, was shot dead when he answered a knock on at his front door. His mother was a local ANC leader. She was a sister at the hospital. And then we had vendettas. So this was followed by the loss of one of the school groundsmen who was related to the Zulu king. A hand grenade was lobbed through his lounge window one night. And so it went on. And we just simply felt that this was nowhere to have our children growing up if we could help it. So we quickly made the decision to leave. We actually had to keep it quiet because at that stage you were regarded as a loser and letting down the side if you left South Africa. But we were dependent on selling our house, and we'd had it on the market anyway for about a year. And so we agreed that if the house was sold, that would be the confirmation that we were meant to go. So we went ahead with all our plans, and our house sold 2 weeks before our departure date. Catherine was 12, and Richard was 10. Having left a senior position as curriculum developer in the National Education Department, it was a huge change for Bernard to take on a long-term relieving position as an English teacher at Otahu College in South Auckland, and I might add, he never complained. We rented a dinky weatherboard house in Pakuranga, and our little South African children went off on their own to 2 different schools. I had a relief teaching job at Maclean's College in Howick. You couldn't get 2 more different schools than Maclean's College and Otahu College. It was interesting to compare notes. Of great encouragement to us all were our visits to several churches in the area. We actually visited a number of churches to decide which one we would be settling in. And it was just fabulous, experiencing that sense of belonging that pervades the fellowships of Christ, no matter where you are. What a comfort it was to sing those well-known choruses and hymns and share in communion with other believers on the other side of the world. No doubt some of you have experienced this on your travels. You did recently, Jeanette, you commented on it. What a wonderful thing is this universal church. We soon felt that we needed to settle in a more provincial setting than Auckland. We did a tiki tour around, figure of 8 around New Zealand. Bernard applied for about 7 teaching positions. And in the end, we both got jobs at New Plymouth Boys High School. I well remember the warm reception that we received from the school's staff and the English department in particular. One of its members was our own John Howes. By April 1995, which is nearly 30 years ago, we started attending Brooklands Church, which was particularly supportive of our children, who had left behind all that was familiar, friends, family, and much-loved pets. I am more than thankful for the way the Lord has used dear people in this church, who to this day have encouraged and shown an interest in my family and latterly myself. I would particularly like to mention Jen and David Pierce, Brian and Gillian Hulse, Anne and Ian Wilson, dear Kathy Ellison, and Lillian Hillier. The disintegration of my marriage after nearly 30 years together has been the hardest blow. But I have learned that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. And our good Lord puts other blessings in our paths. In my case, 2 brave and faithful and actively Christian adult children and beautiful grandchildren, especially the birth of little Margot to my daughter, who lost her first child, Rafi, at 8 days old to a heart condition. My parents gifted me with valuing books, music, and an inquiring outlook. And while sometimes learning shakes the cage of comfort, our God allows us to question and test our comfortableness and our understanding, to use our hearts and minds not to fear, but further our understanding of what is true, the story. After all, God is truth. He is the story. To conclude, when I was 12 years old, I was confirmed at St. Mary's School in Pretoria. The text for the sermon that Bishop Selby Taylor chose that day was Hebrews, verse 1-3. It has remained an inspiration for me over the years, and I'd like to end this testimony with it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Thanks be to God.